Great. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
I think I'm unmuted. Okay. I wanted to expand so I can see some faces. So for those of you who are brave enough to show your face, wonderful. Those who aren't, I understand, because sometimes I'm eating, or like you may see, I have a child on me. So I might be doing certain things. So we pray that my son Samson will just be quiet during this time and continue his rest. If not, have mercy on me. I'm sorry. Welcome to the transition of a mom into private practice, and a son's 2 months old. So I'm working on it. Andrew chose the song for me, and actually I was like, wow, how beautiful. Because the line says, looking for hope, raise your hand, and we'll make it through hand in hand. And this is our call is to have hope when there's so much hopelessness, right? And so my hope is that throughout this talk, I can give some sort of idea and insight into kind of just knowing what your role is, but also knowing when it's appropriate to say, I can't do this. So as Andrew said, I just recently left Catholic Charities and I'm starting my own private practice, and the Lord is good, because one of my hopes was to start doing talks a little bit more. And so within a week of having that prayer, he sent me an email and asked. And so I'm happy to be here. And I'm so grateful that you guys are willing to take some time during your lunch hour just to be with us. So our current society is just showing so much immense, and there's such an immense increase of mental health issues, right? There's a rise in depression, anxiety, suicide, interpersonal relationships, whether that be with the family, domestic violence, parent-child challenges, things like that. I recently in my hometown, a man who goes to mass every single day, who's like joyful when he's there, just recently committed suicide, and just the impact that this time is having. And I'm sure all of you are hearing those stories more and more of what's happening with mental health. And there's so many people who are wounded and looking for someone to love them. I love it because Fratelli Tutti, which I didn't even know about, honestly, and I started reading it once Andrew invited me to give a talk. It says, it beautifully just encourages us to persevere in love and to restore dignity to the suffering and to build a society of the name. But there's a fine line between, loving our neighbor and staying within our role. And I want to first talk about this encyclical and the Good Samaritan, and then share some thoughts of when to refer outside for help, because there is a reality that we can only do so much. Even myself as a clinician, I can only do so much. The Good Samaritan parable depicts just several responses to suffering. So he talks about how some of them pass by the suffering individual and they either retreat inward, or they ignore, or they become indifferent to the plight, or even looking the other way. And I think all of us could probably say, I've probably done all of those things when passing by a suffering individual. I've become inward. I have maybe become indifferent. I've either ignored or completely turned the other cheek. And then there's other times, of course, that we've engaged and we've sought the individual. And Pope Francis writes that there are only two kinds of people: those who care for someone who is hurting, and those who pass by, those who bend down to help, and those who look the other way and hurry off. Here are all the distinctions, labels, and masks fall away. It is the moment of truth. Will we bend down to touch and heal the wounds of others, or will we bend down and help another get up? And I think that's what it is. Are we going to do these things, or are we going to walk away? And sometimes we might have to do both, but how can we do that with charity? So first and foremost, the importance is we have to acknowledge the other. So many people are fighting to receive another person's time. I've had several clients. I can think of one in particular in Colonial Beach. This is little dinky town over by the water. And I remember him saying, when I asked, what are your goals for counseling? What is your purpose? He looked at me and he said, honestly, I just want somebody to listen to me. He was a 70-some-year-old man, and he didn't have anybody. And he was willing to come in and pay $6 a session just to have me listen. Didn't have a goal, didn't have a purpose necessarily, other than just to sit there with another individual. And I think there's a lot of people who are like that. And now, especially as we've entered into this virtual world, there's more and more people who are just wanting to be near another person, to have somebody listen to them, because there's so much isolation happening. When I think about my clients and what the pandemic has done to their mental health, it's oftentimes discouraging and overwhelming. And I'm sure you feel the same way in ministry, where you have these people that you've been serving and you can see they're hurting and you want to reach out and you want to help them, and all you can do is sometimes this virtual interaction. And how do you be there with them? And I think we are really called to be the Lord's ears and heart, and listen to the suffering brothers and sisters that we have, even if it's in a simple manner or a quick interaction. The man that stopped by, the Good Samaritan, he stopped to help the suffering individual by approaching him, helping him personally, even by just spending his own money to show care for his needs. And it states in the encyclical, he had his own plans for that day, his own needs, his own commitments, his own desires. Yet he was able to put all that aside when confronted with someone in need. Without even knowing the injured man, he saw him as deserving of his time and his attention. And I think that's what's hard in ministry. And I've been there as a Focus missionary and then doing lots of ministry after I left Focus, is that there's so much demand on what you have to do in whatever task that is at hand for you. And then somebody comes in and interrupts. And how do we drop those things to care for an individual while also having to accomplish whatever tasks are at hand? And it's difficult. And it's really easy to become frustrated when we're interrupted from our work or our plans for the day. But it's in that moment that we can live out that phrase from Pope Francis, that life is a time for interactions, not simply about the time that passes by. And we have to remember that, as this role that you have, whether as a lay, minister, or whether you're an employee, is that really you're in the role because there's a role for interactions. You're doing the tasks in order to engage people. You're doing the things in order to bring people closer to Christ. It is about interactions. And I think that I'm trying to set the ground for also realizing what comes next is the interruptions that come, but also knowing our limitations. Something that's really been on my mind for the last about 6 months is this idea of being a burden. I think so many people say the word, I don't want to be a burden, or I feel like I'm a burden, or whatever it might be. And this topic has just been sitting with me a lot. I've been taking it to prayer, doing some reading about it. And I think we can quickly believe that being a burden is a negative thing. But the reality is we are made for relationships, and therefore sharing the cross with another person may be something that we're called to do. I think of Simon of Cyrene and how he displayed how to carry the cross with someone. He was standing there, especially if I think about the movie, he was sitting there with his son, and all of a sudden he's asked to carry the cross. He's not wanting to, he's not expecting it, but all of a sudden he's just asked and demanded in some sense to do so. But it's after he gave in and allowed himself to carry that cross with Jesus, his life was transformed. And I think that's the question that we can ask ourselves in those moments when we are asked to talk with somebody, or somebody wants to talk with you, is, are you willing to let your life be transformed, or allow their life to be transformed because of the love and the time and the attention that you're willing to give the other person? The suffering Jesus is going to come to you at an unexpected time, and you are going to have to assess whether you have the time or the emotional ability to do so. And I think this is key. Do you have the emotional ability? Because if you don't, it's actually not helpful. I think about, us as myself as an individual. Would I want to unveil myself to someone who isn't completely present, or who doesn't have the time for me, and therefore, what would leave frustrated? I wouldn't want to do that to another person. If I'm going to unveil, I want them to freely be there and not to feel compelled. And so part of what I'm teaching more and more to my clients and to other people is the idea that says, if you're not there, it's okay to say, hey, I want to love you and I want to listen, but honestly, I don't have the capacity right now. And that is healthier and better than to sit there frustrated, have this person speak to you, and then leave feeling, did they even listen to me? Were they even there? We are doing a disservice if we don't check ourselves. And we're doing our brothers and sisters a disservice. Because outside of loving our neighbor by, giving our time and attention, you may be loving your neighbor by drawing that boundary and not engaging, because it's not complete love. So I want to talk about when it may be appropriate for you to refer to a counselor or to seek other kinds of help for individuals that come your way. Number one is when you don't have the skills to counsel. We all have bits and pieces of the gift of counsel. when I work with my clients, I often pray with them, and I enter into the prayer asking the Lord for the gift of counsel, because I know I have natural tendencies, and all of you have natural qualities of giving counsel. Otherwise, you wouldn't be in ministry. There's a natural desire to help other people, but do you have the skills to help? Even myself, I have to know my limits. I have to know what skills I have and what skills I don't. So when I do a consult with a client, I'll ask them, tell me a little bit about your presenting issue, because I want to know if I can actually serve you. Because if I can't, I don't want to enter into this relationship. So for yourself, do I have the skills? They might say, hey, can I talk to you about X, Y, and Z? And you're going, I don't think that I have the skills. So it's before they engage, draw your limit. The other one is when you don't have the time. You know, when a person is vulnerable, it takes so much courage. And if you don't have the time to help them, then we are really doing a disservice to them. So when we ask for their presenting issue, it's and in counseling, I can ask for it really briefly. I say, don't tell me much, but briefly, can you tell me what you're looking for? Because I don't want to leave them in a place of discouragement or deeper depression, because I've done that, honestly. Early in my career, I can remember taking a phone call and asking a little bit more about what was happening. And all of a sudden I had to go. And I ended the phone call. And I remember feeling so disgusted, because I could hear the just incredible sadness, overwhelm, discouragement in their voice. But I also had to get to the next thing. I had to serve the next person. So be cautious of your time. Do you have the time to engage in something? And if you know that you're in the middle of it and they're talking and you want to be able to get to your next thing, it's okay to say, hey, I know we're talking and you're sharing so much, but I want you to know that I have like 15 minutes and I want to make sure that we're able to leave you in a place of safety, of comfort. So I just want to give you a heads up. That is being charitable, and it's acceptable to let them know, because otherwise you'll run up to it. They're still talking and you start to feel the anxiety because you've got to get to the next thing. And they're feeling like more comfortable and unveiling. So know when you have the time to do so. Another time to refer is when the relationship really shifts from being a lay minister or an employee to a friendship, because there is a probability of and a possibility of dependency, and that dependency is not healthy. I worked with a client for 6.5 years, and I was really her only person. She was abandoned by all of her family. Parents died, so she was an orphan, and plus all of her 6 siblings had rejected her. So I was really her only person. She moved out to Virginia because she thought her relatives would be helpful. They're not. Every week she came and she saw me. And as I left Catholic Charities, a part of me was going, oh my gosh, I can tell that there's a level of dependency on me, and I don't know what I can do. And by the grace of God, thankfully, she recognized this dependency, and so she decided to see another counselor. But we don't want to create dependency, because at some point you're not going to be there. Just like I had to leave Catholic Charities, I'm not going to be there for her. And if I'm her only resource, we have to be aware of that. And I think codependency is a real issue in our culture, because people just don't know how to build healthy relationships. And they don't have a good model of healthy relationships. And so codependency can quickly occur. And when you find yourself feeling worried about how another person's going to react because you may make a shift and you've built that kind of relationship, know that codependency qualities might start sifting into that area. Another way that we know that we have to refer is when you notice yourself giving more time to one individual than others, right? So whether that be, the teen in the youth group, and they keep coming to you, and it's wonderful that they feel so comfortable, but all of a sudden you find yourself giving so much attention to this person because they need it, and we're disregarding all that's happening because there's a whole wealth of other kids who might need you. And so when you notice yourself giving that time, we have to be able to cut our time to work with them, learn how to figure out how to refer them outside, saying, there's a lot going on. And I really think that we need to build your support system. We need to get you a network where it's going to be healthier than just myself. Because I want to honor you, and I want to honor what's going on, because I'm not always going to have the time. And so recognize, am I giving more time to a certain individual right now? And if I am, is it healthy? Is it appropriate? Am I feeling overwhelmed? Because oftentimes there's, in therapy, we call it secondary trauma. And secondary trauma occurs when we find ourselves taking the trauma and the stuff that's occurring from our clients, and all of a sudden we feel the intensity of the emotions. And so when you find yourself kind of taking on, I call this almost like an emotional sponge, where you take on all the emotions and you're going, man, I am feeling X, Y, and Z. And it could be frustrated, it could be sad, it could be irritated, whatever it might be, to check and say, is this my emotion, or are these the emotions of another individual that I've been working with? And oftentimes in therapy, just a quick kind of tool is I do what's called the give and take. I say, it's really helpful sometimes to visualize giving the emotion back to the individual and taking back our peace, taking back our joy, because we don't need to carry another person. We can love another person, but when we take on their stuff, we actually don't become helpful. And so awareness of what emotional baggage you might be carrying that's not your own. Another time is when it begins to feel funny, or when the boundaries become fuzzy, or you think they're being crossed. And this could be spatial boundaries, whether somebody becomes, noticing they become closer and closer to you, whether there's now like a physical aspect to it. It could be a verbal boundaries, where there's appropriateness of words, or professional context that's being skewed. There's a line, and you start to go, I don't know if this is right. And then time boundaries, as I've said a couple times, whether it's phone calls or emails, they're wanting to schedule an appointment more with you, or wanting to spend more time with you. These are times when you start to say, I don't think that this is healthy. It's time for me to reach out for outside help. When a person seeking your help has begun to almost transfer unnecessary power, authority, expectations, responsibility, or a fantasy on you. When those lines become blurred, it's difficult, because the reality is it's wonderful to feel valued. It's wonderful to feel appreciated by someone that you're helping and know that you're really serving, but stay within your responsibility, stay within your authority, because when those lines get crossed, all of a sudden there's a different kind of pressure that gets placed on you that's not helpful. Another time is when you maybe begin to over-identify with the hurting person's problem. All of us have personal history of wounds. That's just reality, right? Maybe they're small, maybe they're big, but we all have a personal history. And some of that unwoundedness is unfinished business. And so when another person begins to unveil what's going on, all of a sudden you might connect with them. And there's beauty to that. But we have to remember, I want to show empathy, but I want to keep my issues separate. And I can tell you, like, there is such a fine line to that, because it can be helpful. Your own history, your own stories, it can be super helpful. But if you're still experiencing the emotional aspects to it, it's really important to keep those boundaries, to keep those limitations. So after I had, I miscarried a couple years ago, and a few weeks later, a client came in and shared her own experience of a miscarriage. And I can tell you that it was really difficult, because I was over-identifying with her hurts and her pains, and it was causing me to experience my own emotion, my own grief. And I actually had to tell her I couldn't help her in this area, because I began to be not focused on what's going on with her, but focused on what's going on with me. So this over-identification is something important for you. Are you experiencing something? I can tell you that I have a clinician that I used to have on my team. She was a single woman and really desiring her vocation. And when she was working with other people who were looking for their vocation and were upset that they didn't find it, I remember often talking to her saying, listen, you've got to be careful, because you can begin to have an anger towards our Lord and an anger towards maybe the lack of men in the world. So be cautious of your own frustrations and how that's being projected into your session with this client. So know your own woundedness, and know how this over-identification could be really difficult when serving these individuals. I am ethically bound to keep confidentiality, right? I have a role that's, people come to me, they share with me, and I ethically have to keep it confidential. Sometimes to the point where it's uncomfortable. But you have, in some sense, a moral obligation, right? You can go ahead and share things, but when you find yourself sharing somebody's story over and over and over again, because a lot of people that we serve, a lot of people that you work with, their stories are they're intense, they're powerful. You can see the hurt, they're overwhelming. And at the same time, we're called to live out the 8th commandment, to not bear false witness. And so you have a role to keep confidentiality as much as you can. And I'll tell you that it's not that I don't talk to other people about my clients specifically, like my cohort or other clinicians. And sometimes, honestly, I'll talk with my husband, but I give nothing of information. I will say, I'm working with this individual with these things. And if I know they're part from my church, I don't share with him at all, because I'm like so scared of the reality of him being like, I think I know who you're talking about, because we just talked to them. And so be cautious of how confidentiality, if you're starting to share a lot about what you just heard with multiple people, that's not healthy, and that's not actually fair. And we are not upholding that commandment, because we don't want to bear false witness, and we don't want to make other people react differently to individuals because of the crosses that they have to carry. The other thing that to be aware of is, do you have a support system? Right. So I just talked about not bearing false witness, and at the same time, we do need people who we can rely upon. And I would say choose 1 or 2 people. Right. So I have 2 clinicians that I feel really comfortable with, that I go to when things are really, really difficult. Do you have your 1 or 2 people who you know you can support, that can support you in those times? Because you are going to need to talk in some extent to people, because there's going to be overwhelming stories, or you're not going to know how to handle a situation. And you might need an outside perspective to say, hey, I think you shouldn't be in this kind of position or this relationship. The other things that I would encourage, the last one is the most, the biggest one, that we all know it, right? Is when there are serious risks, when there's threats to health, threats to safety, threats to welfare, of either hurting themselves, hurting other people, even hurting you, like that type, suicide, homicide, violence, neglect, that's an immediate red flag. That is not your responsibility. You are not trained to help in those areas, and you need to seek outside help. And I think all of you have probably experienced that line of where you probably became over involved in an individual's life, and you've probably had those experiences where you quickly cut somebody off. And temperance is somewhere in the middle, right? We have to find where do I fit? How do I know how to best serve an individual? Because we can't quickly just cut an individual off and not serve them. But we also can be quick and acknowledge their presence. Hey, I know you're hurting. I know a lot is going on, but now is not the time. And I don't have the time, or I don't have the attention. I don't have the capacity to help you. So let's find you those outside resources. So whether that be somebody else within the ministry, whether that be a volunteer, whether that be the family, whether that be counseling, there's so many things that you kind of have to assess and get your feelers for. Build up and I'm happy to hear that Andrew has resources for you, because even myself as a clinician, when I have somebody reach out to me, I have other clinicians that I send people to, because I don't have the time. And I don't love people sitting and waiting around for counseling, because it takes so much courage to seek it out. So making sure that you have your resources, somewhere prevalent, so you can actually give that resource to the individuals. But also, don't just be a resource giver. Be somebody who's charitable in it. Give them a little time, right? But it's important for you to remember our call to love while knowing our limitations. And as the encyclical says and encourages us, foster what is good and place ourselves at its service.